Well, that's good. Well,
Try again?
okay. So, welcome back from Thanksgiving. It's been a week. Hopefully, you're done with all of your leftovers. This is the last of our public sessions for this semester. We will return to this time and space on January the 8th, 2020, and the spring semester will examine climate change, resilience, and sustainability. We've lined up, I think, a very extraordinary group of individual speakers and presentations, and we will also be making a very sincere effort to involve folks in our adjacent communities in some of this dialogue as well. So if you have an interest in what's going on within our environment and how public policy is addressing those issues, we will be addressing that in the spring semester. I would add a personal note about the class this semester. I don't think I've ever been involved with a course wherein we joked at the outset that we would have to check media just before we came into every class, but that's the way it has been this semester for all of us. I had one of those NPR moments just before coming into today's class as folks were debriefing the impeachment hearings in Washington. I think we've all learned a lot, and the bottom line, I think, for many of us is that we live in a state of flux where the media plays as much of a role in shaping policy as has ever been the case in human history, we could almost say. And I'm grateful to my colleagues, Dan and Jonathan, and also to Jean and Brandy for the work that they've done to make this course the kind of success that it's been this semester. And I want to thank our students who came to every class well prepared to ask great questions, and those of you from the more general public who've come into these sessions who've added a richness to our conversations that one doesn't ordinarily find in academic discourse. So thank you all, and let me turn this over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Ted. I want to second that. Behind the scenes, Jean Patrizzo has done an incredible job, both keeping us technologically competent, but also working on publicity and kind of, just working on a lot of the logistics that really made it possible. So thank you for doing that. Tonight we have a very good speaker who's going to join us on a panel to talk about kind of both the past and the future. Richard Arenberg will be introduced by Dan Ehrman, but he's been in Washington a long time, lived through the Clinton impeachment. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is, how are we going to emerge from this era? Will it be a permanent change in Washington, or is this just a spasm and we'll return to what we used to think of as normalcy after next November? And I think that'll be a nice way to kind of wrap things up. I did want to start out with a slightly longer than usual video. This one's about 10 minutes long, but I think captures a lot of the absurdity that we're feeling right now and some of the muddle that surrounds the campaign. So let's start with this. So I wanted to just kind of start things off by looking at, can we get that on? Sorry. Okay, there we go. Talking a little bit, kind of a sort of historical perspective here. So looking back to 2016, where we stood back in 2016. So one of the things that's interesting is to sort of get a feel for how predictive or unpredictive the early campaign can be. Dan Ehrman pointed out in class that back in 2004, John Kerry was like at Cory Booker levels at this point. And it was only as the primaries went on and the people coalesced around this idea of a electable candidate that he started surging. 2015 was a little bit different, which is that 11 months before the 2016 election, Trump actually had broken out in front. A few weeks earlier, Ben Carson, remember Ben Carson, had been tied with Trump for the lead among Republican voters, but he began dropping. Trump came to the fore and basically, held the lead in a very crowded field of candidates for the rest of the primaries. At the time, and this is kind of interesting, 26% of voters said they would definitely not support Trump. And this idea of the never Trumpers is something that was true, people thought, through the election and afterwards. But as we see in the polls now, support for Trump in the Republican Party has just increased and has remained rock solid and has even gotten stronger, even through impeachment, through all the revelations that we've had about Trump's personal life, revolving staffs in the White House, and so forth. This is a quote, again, from 2015, 4 years ago, from a pollster, saying it doesn't seem to matter what he says or who he offends, whether the facts are contested or the political correctness is challenged, Donald Trump seems to be wearing Kevlar. And that is a statement that could be made basically every year since and could be made today, showing that Trump, despite what many Democrats have hoped, has held on to his base. And it was interesting in our class just now, the students talked about their kind of Thanksgiving political encounters, and none of them really ran into any Trump relative or Trump voting relative who was prepared to change their mind. Ted Landsmark ran into one at his Thanksgiving table, but that person wasn't sure who they would vote for. And again, I think the belief back 4 years ago, which was the belief many Democrats I think have had up until recently, is, Secretary Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have to be hoping Trump is the GOP's guy. But again, one thing that I think we've seen in this class and seen in recent months is that the Democratic hope that, Trump is beatable seems to be not as true as everyone hopes. Of all the stories that have come out about the election, this one I think probably had the most impact, certainly in political circles, but I think among voters as well. It was a New York Times story that ran about a month ago that looked at the battleground states. Now, remember, at the time, Warren was surging in the polls. A lot of people, including people here on our panel, felt that she was going to be the nominee, and she may still be the nominee. But this was a poll that I think caught a lot of attention because of the story it said about who would be the strongest candidate versus Trump. And one of the things it showed was that Warren was either even or trailing Trump in all but one of the battleground states. It showed Biden doing better, Bernie kind of in the middle, but the overall story it told was that Trump was actually in many ways stronger against Warren than many people, especially people living in the northeastern bubble, had thought. And I think this is something that we're going to be seeing more and more focus on because it's going to be clear that the election may once again be decided in these battleground states. So I think one of the reasons for Biden's sort of resurgence may be because of Medicare for all, and there are other reasons for that. But this does seem to be an election, and we're hearing this, I think, even among our social circles, where voters are looking strategically. The Democrats are looking at strategic choices. They really want someone who will beat Trump, and so polling data like this could be very influential. The great danger, of course, as we learned from 2016, is that polls can be wrong. And one of the concerns is that people begin to look at these polls, which are presented with such kind of authority and scientific certainty, and they'll begin to either choose candidates based on it or may turn out or not turn out based on it. And that's going to be, I think, an ongoing concern in terms of the role the media plays with polling and how voters look at it. I think when we started, and certainly maybe cresting about a month or two ago, there was a belief that, Elizabeth Warren might be able to win Iowa, win New Hampshire, crack Biden's wall in South Carolina, and kind of move on to the nomination, or that Biden might be able to do that. One of the things that I think people are starting to coalesce around is that there might be a scenario where Buttigieg could win Iowa, Warren could win New Hampshire, Biden could win South Carolina, Bernie Sanders could win Nevada. And sort of like the Democrats in previous elections back in 2004, we could have a situation where the primary race just keeps on going. And that Super Tuesday on February 3rd ends up being, the Super Tuesday, which is March 3rd, ends up being very important. And so the focus that we all have on Iowa and New Hampshire, in part because New Hampshire is so close to us, may be supplanted by South Carolina, but then all the way into Super Tuesday. And this is one of the bets that Mike Bloomberg is making. By bypassing these early races, he can then have a good showing on Super Tuesday and start to lay a claim. There are some people who think this may go right to the convention, that you could have a situation where Biden, because he has a lot of support among African-American voters, will continue to do well on Super Tuesday and afterwards, but that Warren will do well, Buttigieg, that there'll be this kind of ongoing fight among the top 4 or 5 candidates that will end up at the convention. So it feels like we need to kind of buckle in for a long ride. At the same time, I think we also have to be humbled by what history tells us, especially about a place like Iowa. So the leader in the December polls, where we are now, tends to win the caucuses in Iowa less than half the time. In fact, in the last 10 contested Democratic contests in Iowa, the candidate who was in first place in December polling won just 3 times. Mondale in 84, Gore in 2000, and Hillary Clinton in 2016. In 2004, John Kerry won Iowa after being 6th in December polling behind the leader Howard Dean. So in just a month, Kerry was able to completely change the dynamic in Iowa. George McGovern was 5th in December in 1972, went on to win Iowa. Bill Clinton was 4th. Mike Dukakis was 3rd. Once Jimmy Carter was 10th in December polling and won the caucuses. So if the race plays along these lines, it's possible that the Democratic nominee may not be chosen until the summer at the convention in Milwaukee. And in terms of strategically kind of what this means for the various candidates is they're going to be trying to figure out who are their firewall supporters, who will support them through a long nominating contest. And Joseph Biden seems to be sort of the best positioned at this point, in part because of his strong support from African-American voters. Iowa and New Hampshire, as we know, are disproportionately white, and they give kind of a much bigger boost to candidates who appeal to white voters. Once New Hampshire is over, that shifts dramatically. The majority of voters in the Democratic primary in South Carolina are African American, and that's true not as dramatically, but in every state after that, African Americans and then Latinos start to play more and more of a role. Recent polls show Biden has 44% support among black voters. It seems to be holding firm. Elizabeth Warren has gotten Ayanna Pressley to endorse her. It'll be interesting to see if that creates some support, especially among younger African-American voters. Bernie Sanders is second with 30% support. And Pete Buttigieg obviously is working very hard to try to bolster his African-American support. So that's kind of politically where we stand, which is a lot more uncertain than where we started, I think, when the class began, and also not really knowing kind of what's going to happen over the next few months. There are bound to be stumbles, bound to be moments. I think one thing the Democrats are probably concerned about is that whether you like him or not, the Republican debates clarified things, and that Trump began this ascent and sort of one by one sort of knocked off all the other Republican candidates. Now, that may be a flaw in the system, but it did help the Republicans to coalesce around him by the time the election came. Most of the Republicans came home. The Democrat debates so far seem to just be muddling things more and more. The race is still kind of where it stood when things started. And a long fought out primary makes it harder to believe that at the end everyone will come together. And I think that's a concern that Democrats have to have. It may explain one reason why Kamala Harris withdrew now, because it preserves her strength to be a possible vice presidential pick. So now we're going to invite up Richard Arenberg from Brown University to give us some perspective, and I'll turn this over to Dan Ehrman, who's going to introduce him.
Thank you, Jonathan. So Rich Arenberg is uniquely situated to offer perspective on our current political culture and fast-moving targets. Rich first started working for Congress for someone who was called a Watergate baby, and that was Paul Tsongas when he was in the House, another Greek American from Massachusetts. We kicked off this class with Governor Dukakis, and then went on to work for a total of 34 years in Congress, and most of it working for the Senate. So when Tsongas became Senator Tsongas, then for Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell from Maine, and then for Senator Carl Levin from Michigan. So one thing that Rich has is perspective. He basically joined the staff of a member of Congress on the heels of Watergate. He was working for Senator Levin throughout Bill Clinton's impeachment, and he has been studying the role of polarization and also the ultimate demise of the filibuster in the Senate. So Rich has a great perspective on everything we're facing and what we've faced before. So please join me in welcoming Rich Arenberg.
Well, thank you. I don't know how I can live up to that introduction or the Saturday Night Live clip.
Everyone here?
Can you hear me all right? Good. I agree with much of what has been said thus far about the primary election. I had a couple of thoughts while you were speaking about Iowa, and I think you touched on a couple of them anyway. But the first one would be that it's very early to be reading Iowa. It's typical of the Iowa caucus, as you said, that it breaks very late, and that if you start reading the tea leaves, I mean, Buttigieg, for example, looks very strong there right now, but that can change enormously. The second thing is that Iowa is about as unrepresentative of the country and the party as you can think of, except maybe New Hampshire. So Dan mentioned my three former bosses. Carl Levin, who I worked for, was one of the leading proponents in the Democratic Party of taking away the special privilege that Iowa and New Hampshire have. In fact, it was his efforts that got Michigan to jump ahead of, in 2008, Michigan actually jumped ahead of New Hampshire in the leapfrogged anyway. And the Democratic Party responded by taking their delegates' votes away. Obama gave them back, of course, but that's by then he was the nominee. So I think it's there's always the danger, I think, of overreacting to a victory in Iowa and in New Hampshire, and I think that danger is with us again in this particular field, because I think, for example, that Joe Biden can probably weather a third or fourth place finish in Iowa and maybe a third place finish in New Hampshire, as long as they do a good job of keeping expectations low going into that. And then I think he's likely to do well in Nevada, and of course, we've all come to think of South Carolina as his protective wall because of his strength with African American voters. But there's no real indication that that's weakening, and if he's able to demonstrate that in South Carolina, of course, as was mentioned, the parade then goes on to Super Tuesday, which this time around, particularly because California is a part of it, 40% of all the delegates at the convention are going to be elected to those positions on that single day. So to go back up for a second, the third thing that I wanted to say about Iowa is one of the things I did for Paul Tsongas back in the dark ages many years ago here in Massachusetts was I was his pollster. And one of the things as a pollster always strikes me about Iowa is that it's damn difficult to poll. Caucuses are in general, because in order to do a very accurate poll, primaries in general are difficult. Caucuses are especially difficult because the challenge is figuring out who it is that's going to turn up on caucus day. And whereas for a general election, pollsters are pretty good at figuring out who likely voters are. When you're talking about a caucus in a place like Iowa, where the weather is a big factor, where the fact that in order to participate in the caucus, you got to go there and basically spend all day. And the other big factor is that, many of these people are in small towns and so forth. They're not very anxious to go to the caucus where the process is not the Australian ballot. Everybody knows who you voted for. The way a caucus works, you may know, is if this was the Iowa caucus, we would say, well, okay, everybody that's for Sanders, assemble in that corner, everybody for Warren in that corner, everyone for Buttigieg up there, and so forth. That's right. And then if there's a particular threshold that candidates have to meet to stay in the running for the caucus, and if they don't, then those people who are over in that corner redistribute themselves to other corners. Well, it's a very interesting process, and those of us that are political junkies would probably have a lot of fun doing that. But for a lot of people, it makes them extremely uncomfortable. So one of the difficulties in trying to predict what's going to happen in Iowa, and I think one of the reasons why the polling always seems so volatile there, is that it's very difficult to figure out who the likely voters are, and that's absolutely crucial. So let me stop there.
So how do you see it playing out? So let's say the African American wall holds in South Carolina. What happens on Super Tuesday? And if you had to make a prediction, where are we going to be in July?
Well, I think if Joe Biden, if we make the assumption, and maybe it's wrong, but if we make the assumption that Joe Biden holds on to a large percentage of the African American vote in South Carolina, I think he'll be very strong across the South, where in the Democratic Party, the African American vote is crucial. And in fact, for the most part, it's crucial across the country, leaving Iowa and New Hampshire out for the moment. So that unless and until one of the other candidates in the field demonstrates that they can seriously break into that African American vote that Biden has appeared to have thus far, I think it's going to be difficult in the end to defeat Biden for the nomination, particularly because I think that this notion that we saw from that poll you put up there, the notion that Biden is the strongest candidate against Trump has been around really from the outset. And obviously he's become more vulnerable mostly because of the perceived performance in each of the debates and some of the gaffes that he's made. But the fact that his portion of the national vote and his strength with African American voters has proved resilient. And I think many Democrats, even those who support other candidates, begrudgingly feel in their heart of hearts that Biden may be the strongest candidate to challenge Trump, largely because, what got Trump elected was Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And these are states in which Biden is expected to be strong.
Well, let me raise a caveat about South Carolina, and I would be one of the last people to question the strength and the potency of the African American vote in South Carolina. But I've been there a fair amount, and there have been radical changes in the demographics of South Carolina over the course of the last half dozen years, particularly on the Democratic side, and particularly along the coasts, where very large numbers of white voters have relocated from places like Pennsylvania and Michigan. A number of them are white Democrats. And I now start to wonder, particularly with Kamala Harris out of the race, who might run second and what it would mean for Biden if, in fact, there were a strong second candidate who emerged in South Carolina rather than in one of the other states.
Yeah, well, of course, well, okay. Of course, in the march of primaries through the season, one thing that's very important each step along the way are the expectations. And that's why I said with respect to Iowa and New Hampshire that Biden's got to manage those expectations in order to be able to survive third or fourth place finishes. And I think he could be damaged that way in South Carolina, as you point out, if whoever the candidate is that finishes second, particularly is particularly surprising. If it's someone that's thought of as much weaker among African American votes, and they cut into that, and they only lose to Biden by a couple of percentage points or something like that, that could be very damaging to his campaign.
You've worked for politicians, you've worked for ambitious politicians. What happens, say, after Super Tuesday? You know, there's this feeling from 2016 that Bernie Sanders didn't rally people for Hillary fast enough. You know, will there be a coalescence quickly, or even if Biden does seem to be kind of on the march, will it be hard to unite people?
I think the biggest answer to that question is in the hands of Donald J. Trump. I think that the desire at this point amongst Democrats to defeat Trump in the 2020 election is going to drive turnout. This is going to be a turnout election. You know, we used to think of elections as a battle for the swing voter in the middle. Kind of step by step, we've begun to give up on that, and things are now, as you pointed out, so solidified in terms of Republicans coalescing behind Trump and Democrats against him that it's hard to imagine where those persuadable voters are. So I think it's, in a large part, it's going to be a contest between Trump's ability to, which is formidable, to fire up his base and to bring them out on election day, and likewise amongst Democrats to coalesce and bring out that vote. And again, the key places to look are going to be amongst those segments of the Democratic Party where turnout has been traditionally lower. You know, except for the Obama years, African American, Hispanic, and young voters. Those are the groups to watch in terms of turnout. If they turn out in record numbers, Donald Trump will be a one-term president.
So today we saw some hearings in the House Judiciary Committee. You have seen what an impeachment process without a removal in the Senate does. And I think there are two stories about Bill Clinton's impeachment. One of them is actually he gained seats in the 98 midterms. He emerged from it. And the counter argument is, yes, but his party was weakened, and Al Gore definitely bore the brunt of the cost in the 2000 election. So maybe you could offer your perspective on where we are.
Some people, by the way, would say that Al Gore, because he divorced himself from Clinton
Too far,
in
right?
Campaign,
Right,
rather than racing.
right.
Because Clinton, after all, we tend to forget.
Popular.
You know, we're used to presidents now with solid 40% support across the board, consistently.
60, yeah.
After having been acquitted in the Senate, and actually all throughout the impeachment, Bill Clinton was at 70%.
Job approval, right? So I guess what I'm asking is how you see this playing out, and any effect on some of the factors you talked about before in those states. You know, could impeachment and non-removal still weaken him?
Okay. Well, first, one observation about the primaries is that, remember, there are still, even with Kamala Harris now out, there are 5 senators who are in the field. Well, this impeachment is going to go into the Senate for a trial probably in January, right in the period leading up to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, the critical states we've been talking about. Those 5 senators are going to be trapped in Washington. I think Liz Warren has already recognized that. I mean, she said rather emphatically that that's, you know, as a senator, that's her constitutional role, and if there's a trial in the Senate, she'll be there at her desk every day, as she should be. And it's always a problem for senators running for president to kind of manage their time in and out of the Senate. Some just take the strategy of just taking the hit and just not going back to Washington. Others fly back and forth all the time and try to cast as many votes as they possibly can. But one thing that makes that possible in the Senate, of course, is you only have to be there when a roll call vote is occurring. The rest of the time, nobody knows where you are. And so, except you want the people of Iowa to know where you are, and that's where you're likely to be. But not true for an impeachment trial, because the senators throughout the impeachment trial, as Dan said, I was there in the Senate for the Clinton trial. Senators sit at their desks throughout the trial, and the absence of a particular senator, particularly with the world watching those senators running for president, would not go unnoticed. And of course, another interesting thing about them being stuck there is most people don't realize, but under the Senate impeachment rules, senators can't speak. Now, that's a novel thing for a U.S. senator. I'm sure you'll recognize. They are jurors. They are not able to speak. And in fact, the deliberations, when it takes place, take place behind closed doors. They just go back there and debate things, and then they come out and they vote. Now, this, along with everything else, is subject to change, by the way. There are 26 Senate impeachment rules, and what I like to say is they explain less than they leave in terms of question marks, because much of the procedure is just not clearly laid out by those 26 rules. So in the past, what's happened, and I'm coming to your point about polarization. In the past, what's happened is that the leadership, I'll use the Clinton example. We had, in the Clinton case, we had a very partisan impeachment in the House of Representatives, virtually party line, very much like we're going to have this time. But when the trial went over to the Senate, the majority leader, Trent Lott, who was a Republican, and Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader, were very concerned about protecting the reputation, the dignity of the Senate, and also in providing a very fair trial to the president. And so there was a fair amount of agreement about that, although there was a lot of partisan bickering. I don't want to give the wrong impression. Things, this is the late 90s, 98. Things were already very partisan, not quite where we are today. But the way in which the rules get fleshed out is that Daschle and Lott asked Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts and Senator Phil Gramm, the Republican from Texas, to draft a resolution, which they did, and that resolution was put before the Senate, and it was passed on a bipartisan basis. In fact, as bipartisan as you can get, 100-0. Well, I wouldn't take a deep breath and hold it, waiting for the Senate to repeat that performance this time around. They may surprise me. Schumer and McConnell may get together and agree to some factors, but maybe not, which will leave, for the most part, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the driver's seat, because unlike the Senate with its protective filibuster rule, a speech for another day, I wrote a book called Defending the Filibuster, so just to let you know where I come from on that. But it doesn't apply during the impeachment trial, so that things are decided by a majority vote. Now, a lot of power will be in the hands of the presiding officer. And you may know the presiding officer is the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts in this case. And he could be acting like a trial judge. In the past, the Chief Justice, for the most part, has not wanted to get their hands all that dirty in the Senate messiness and in the battle between the legislative and executive branch. And also, they don't know the Senate rules particularly well. And so they're in the position, the Chief Justice is in the position that the presiding officer always is in. The Senate, going all the way back to the very first Senate, when John Adams showed up as the president of the Senate to take control, the senators said, oh, hold on a minute, you're from the executive branch. No way we're going along with that. And they kept the position of presiding officer in the Senate very weak, not anything like the Speaker of the House side. And so it's a weak position. But, of course, the Chief Justice brings additional authority with him. Presumably, if he wanted to do that aggressively, if he wanted to act very differently than Rehnquist did in the Clinton trial, he could. He probably will rely mostly on the parliamentarian. Now, when you watch the Senate trial, you know, there's an upper podium and then there's a second level, and there are 4 officials on that second level. As you face the podium, the person second from the left is the parliamentarian. It's now a woman. She will be sitting in a swivel seat, and any time that the presiding officer has to say anything in the Senate, she swivels around, or her deputies sitting in that seat swivels around, and in a very quiet voice tells the presiding officer what to say, and then they say it. And Chief Justice Rehnquist was no exception. In fact, I like to tell a cute little story about that. The co-author of my filibuster book is a man named Bob Dove, who was a former parliamentarian of the Senate. He was parliamentarian at that time. And he told me this story that during the impeachment hearings, his dad came to Washington to kind of feel proud, you know, watch his son up there on the podium at this historic moment. So he was up in the gallery, and at a certain tricky point in the procedure that was going on the floor, in a stage whisper that could be heard all across the galleries, all around the Senate, Rehnquist turned to Bob and said, "What the hell do I do now?" So this was a great moment for his dad, obviously.
Let me ask you a political question. So we've seen the Mueller report. There was great expectation among Democrats about that. Ended up kind of fizzling, solidified Trump's support. The impeachment hearings in the House, again, great expectations, smoking guns, whatever. You know, there'll be no Republicans voting for impeachment. If you had to predict, what do you think, will the Senate trial be any different, or where will we be when it's over from a political point of view?
Well, that's an excellent question. If you'd caught me a month ago, I probably would have said people are a little too cynical prematurely about the Senate, and that there are a number of Republican senators still in the Senate that I know personally and respect a great deal. I've been profoundly disappointed by every single one of them, basically, throughout this the period of the Trump presidency. But I thought, under the pressures of a trial in the Senate, and the Senate will make an effort to be more substantive and at least appear to be fairer than what you expect to see in the House. But as I've watched the process unfold, and I've watched the comments that people are making, and I've watched the hearings, and I've watched the reaction of public opinion, I've come to believe that there's a very good chance that we'll see pretty much a party line vote in the Senate, unless something happens between now and then to change that calculation. So, you know, going back to that comparison to the Clinton circumstance. Remember that the Senate, I described the resolution, and I described the leaders working together, and I described the concern about the reputation of the body. But in fact, when they got to the vote, that 10 Republicans voted against convicting Clinton on perjury, which was thought to be the easier of the two articles of Freudian slip. Articles of impeachment, and on the other one, which was obstruction, it was 5 Republicans who voted not guilty. And so the outcome was considerably more bipartisan than might have been expected going into the trial in the Senate, and is almost certain to be considerably more bipartisan than we'll see this time.
And as someone who worked for Democratic senators, politically, is impeachment a mistake?
Well, I always thought so. For a long time, and in all of my classes, I've been at Brown now for 11 years, in all of my classes, I have always taken the position that a partisan impeachment is a mistake. That if a party can't convince any portion of the minority to go along with them on impeachment, it's a mistake because it will be viewed as partisan, as political, and as an effort just to pull down a president of the other party. So I felt that way going in, and I felt I admired Speaker Pelosi when she was pumping the brakes, and I thought she was doing the right thing, but I flipped before she did, because what convinced me was when the president began stonewalling the Congress across the board, saying that no subpoenas will be answered. I'll prevent all the members of my administration from the notion of absolute privilege, all of that. That convinced me that in spite of the downside of having to vote a one-party impeachment, that it would be worse for the House to stand mute in the face of a very fundamental violation of our constitutional system. So, however you may feel about whether the Ukraine story rises to the level of impeachment, and maybe that's the one credible position that you'll probably see more in the Senate than you see in the House, and that is senators who will be willing to criticize the president for what he did in the Ukraine case, but then go on to say, I don't believe it rises to the level of impeachment, and then vote against impeachment. However you may feel about that, it seems to me that the case against the president for obstruction of Congress is unassailable, fundamental, violates the Constitution, violates his oath of office, and I think that even if the Senate is going to acquit him, we need to have the House of Representatives on the historic record taking exception to that.
Yeah, so why don't we open it to questions? Brandy will find you.
Or comments?
Thank you. That was very interesting. Now that Kamala Harris is out of the race, where do you see her coalition going and why?
Well, for one thing, I think there's a fairly good chance that she'll wind up the next vice president of the United States, by the way. I'm not sure where her coalition goes. If you believe the polls at this point, it's a pretty slim coalition, So I'm not sure that it's, that if they split off to several candidates, I'm not sure that it's going to make a tremendous impact. But I think she does retain a fair amount of credibility, and I think probably part of the calculation for this early withdrawal. I mean, you would think that even though she was running out of money and everything, that you would think that a candidate who at least at one point had been thought to be in the first tier or the slightly second tier, you would think a candidate like that would at least hang in there and hope for lightning to strike in Iowa. But I think a big part of the calculation is she could be the running mate of almost anybody in the field.
I've got two questions. Hillary Clinton got nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. What bearing, if any, does that have on where we are at this moment?
That's a good question. I mean, I like to cite that a lot because I think although nobody questions, for better or for worse, rightly or wrongly, we have a constitution that includes the Electoral College, and President Trump was elected president by the Electoral College. But I think you need to accept that, but it stops there. You know, when people begin to talk about the mandate, or he says, I was elected president, I ran on the wall, and I did, well, no. When he's talking about a mandate in our democracy can only, is a mantle that is awarded by a large majority of the population. And if she had 3 million more supporters than he did, she had more of a mandate than he did in terms of the issues that were being put forward. By the way, I want to take issue with what you were saying a little earlier about the polling in 2016. Actually, the national polling was right on the mark. It showed Hillary Clinton with about a 2 percentage point lead over Trump, and that's about what she got. She got 3 million more votes than he did.
Michael Bloomberg.
Yeah. Well, I think Saturday Night Live did a pretty good job there, I must say. I don't really have a lot to add to that. I mean, I think it's hard at this point to see where his base is going to come from. Now, maybe if you assume Biden faltering and Buttigieg faltering and the party kind of searching around for somebody on the more moderate end to pick up that mantle, I think we tend to think in terms of these two lanes a little bit too much. I think that that many of the Democrats in the field are viable in what we think of as the majority of the Democratic Party, putting aside the extremes on one end or the other. But I think the only way that Bloomberg gets any traction, I think, is if things are starting to come apart at the seams for pretty much the whole Democratic field. In other words, Biden is faltering, Buttigieg is looking like he can't get black votes, he can't get votes in the middle of the country. Warren is looking like people across the country, not on the coast, are thinking of her as a socialist. Same thing with Bernie. If it seems that all of that is unwinding, then maybe somebody like Bloomberg could arise from the dust. But I wouldn't count on it.
And if there is not a clear front runner at the end of the kind of open process, and it ends up at the convention, as has been suggested, what happens then? It's been a long time since we've seen one of those.
Well, of course, I was thinking when that got brought up that all of us political junkies, we just pray for that every 4 years. And every 4 years, there's like this diminishing hope that maybe it's going to go all the way and we're going to have an open convention, and in the modern era, it just never materializes. There are a couple of factors, though, that are a little bit newer that kind of lean in that direction. I'll mention those. One is that on the Democratic side now, all of the primaries and caucuses are proportional, which means that even if you get on a roll and you win a lot of states and you win the majority of the states on Super Tuesday and so forth, when they get finished doling out the delegates that people have earned, if there are still 4 or 5 viable candidates who are in fact getting enough of the vote, in fact get delegates, that's one thing. The other thing is, after the debacle of the last couple, I think of it as a debacle, of the last couple of contests on the Democratic side, where the superdelegates, so-called, those are delegates that are not elected in the caucus or in the primary, but are delegates at the convention by virtue of the positions they hold. They hold Democratic elected office. In some cases, it's even members of the Democratic National Committee. There's even a couple of big fundraisers sprinkled in there. Certainly, I think it was one of the things that in 2016 worked very much against Bernie Sanders throughout, and that was that Hillary Clinton had a virtual headlock on almost all of the superdelegates. And so unless that could be broken, and Bernie kept talking about breaking that, no evidence that he, I don't know that there's evidence that he ever peeled off a single super delegate. Clinton always had that in the bank, and it helped to make her look pretty much inevitable throughout the process, even as Sanders was beating her in a lot of places, and support for Sanders was surging amongst the party. Well, in the wake of that, the DNC has adopted a reform. And so this time around, the superdelegates will still be there. They won't get a vote on the first ballot unless it doesn't matter. I think that's cute. It's kind of like the vote we give to delegates in the House of Representatives or to the representative from the District of Columbia. You get a vote, but it only counts if it doesn't decide the issue. So that'll be it on the first ballot. But if that helps to get us to a brokered convention and we get to a second ballot, well, watch out. Those superdelegates. I think, if past is prologue, you probably assume that Biden's got a larger percentage of those superdelegates. But I still, given the way, the amounts of money involved, given the way that what it takes to stay in the race all the way to the finish, I tend to expect that the field will start collapsing and that eventually it will narrow to 3 and then ultimately to head-to-head and will resolve itself finally before we get to the convention.
I'm thinking about how much fun it would be for a political junkie to see somebody nominated on the 7th ballot. So what I wanted, he can't have been in this room too often, or as often as I have, without first thinking of Governor Dukakis talking time and time again about the necessity to have good field organizations. And because this year is so much more compact than other years, and because there's so many candidates to spread the money around, is field organization after Super Tuesday going to be really difficult? And what other issues are there around field organization?
I think field organization always important. Get tired of people calling it boots on the ground. Right. But particularly in any state that still holds a caucus, because as I said, difficult to get people to go to caucuses. So if you have a field organization that's done a good job of identifying who their supporters are and do a good job of going out there and, driving buses around and picking them up and taking them to the caucus and holding their hands and keeping them at the caucus and so forth, that makes field organization very important in those states. But in a contest where turnout is going to matter, as I've said, I think is going to be crucial. It's often field organization that gets people to turn out, and that's been true in politics, not only for as long as I can remember, but I think for as long as boots on the ground used to mean in places like Boston and New York, it used to mean handing out turkeys on the street corner. Well, I think, yeah. I mean, in big states, being, what you're able to do in terms of mass media is an important factor. I mean, I worked for Paul Tsongas. I was working for George Mitchell, who was the majority leader by the time Tsongas ran for president. But ultimately, what did him in, people forget that he defeated Bill Clinton in New Hampshire and then went next to Maryland and defeated him in Maryland. And in those days, third on the chart. Iowa was not a factor because Tom Harkin was in the race. So nobody went to Iowa because he was the senator from Iowa. So Tsongas won New Hampshire, Tsongas won Maryland, and next on the docket was Florida. Well, Florida has, I forget how many, but 10 or 12 large media markets, very expensive state to run in, and Tsongas was just not able to raise that kind of money that quickly, and ultimately that was the beginning of the end for him. Clinton had been raising money for a presidential race for many, many years. So if the internet had just come along a little bit sooner for Paul Tsongas, he was the kind of candidate like some of them that we see now who are able to raise huge sums of money from small donors on the internet. It might have been a different story.
I wanted to ask kind of a future question. One of the things that Ted talked to the students about is how are you going to make an impact? What are you going to do kind of going forward? And I'm wondering, as a veteran of Washington, seeing what's going on now, does Washington still make sense for people who want to get involved in journalism or politics or policy? Or is the local level better? Is polarization something that's going to make politics not fun but unpleasant?
Well, I have a serious case of what we call Potomac fever. Always have had. I mentioned that I've been away for 11 years now. I still miss it every single day. And the worse it gets on the Hill, the more, my juices start flowing and I want to be in there for the good fight. Don't misunderstand me. I love teaching and I love Brown, and I've had the opportunity to write a couple of books, and so I don't regret the decision at all, but I do miss it. And I advise students to go to Washington all the time, particularly to work on the Hill. It really gets into your bloodstream. And in fact, there are a bunch of former students of mine now that I fondly call the Ehrenberg Caucus. And, I try to have dinner with them whenever I'm in Washington and so forth, working in various offices on Capitol Hill. Having said that, I think what lies under your question is just how broken Washington looks. And I think in some ways it's almost masked by the Trump presidency. And that is how serious the intense partisan polarization has gotten, and how dangerous I think that is for a democratic system. I mean, One of the reasons why Capitol Hill has so much trouble working is you can't get either party to come to the table any longer. And democracy, I like to say, requires negotiation, moderation. Another word for that is legislating. And so as the parties have become more rigidly polarized, we see it reflected in the media. We see it reflected in campaign finance. I teach a course called Polarized Politics. We look at all of those factors. There's even a religion aspect to it. We see how important, for example, it's been to Trump to have the support of evangelical Christians. Who would have ever predicted that? Looking at his history, but yet, yeah. Dan says God works in mysterious ways.
Do you see this? Do you see that passing, or even after Trump leaves, will that?
I think in that sense, Trump is as much a symptom as he is a cause. There's no question but that he's accelerated it. He's made it worse because, just because it's highly polarized doesn't mean it has to be quite so vile. But nonetheless, and personalized and weaponized, but nonetheless, it has gotten very rigid. I've kept track of my own vote studies for the Senate since I first went there in 1978. And what I do is I keep track of all senators, and I used to measure them all against Paul Tsongas as the standard basic liberal, and then when he left the Senate, I moved it to Carl Levin, who then ultimately became my third boss. And now I still do it, and I use Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island. Basically, what I want is a basic liberal, somebody who's very likely to continually be reelected. And I keep track of how often every other member of the Senate votes with them, and then rank order them. And what I'm interested in is not saying, okay, because it's not all that scientific. I'm not interested in saying, well, okay, Kamala Harris is, votes with him 97.5%, and Booker votes with him 97.8%, so he's more liberal. I don't think you can use it that way. But what I am interested in is basically the overlap. In other words, how many senators fall between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican? How big is that overlap? Basically, the moderates. When I first did it in 1979, don't hold me to the exact number because I haven't looked at it for a while, but it was more than a third of the Senate. It was something like 38 senators that were in the middle. And at that time, there were Republican senators who were very conservative, who were moderates, who were a little less conservative, and in fact, there were a number of Republican senators who were considered liberals. In fact, when I first started doing this overlap, I had to leave Jack Javits of New York out of it as kind of an outrider because he was the fourth most liberal member of the Senate. It would have screwed up all of the data. So I left him out, and I left Harry Byrd out because he voted with the Democratic caucus, but he ran as an independent from Virginia, and he was probably the most conservative senator at the time. So between Javits and Byrd, the whole thing would have made no sense. So I left them both out, but never had to again for any other senator going forward all the way to this day. And from 1979, year by year by year, every year, the number got smaller. So it dropped to about 12 and then to about 5. And now for a period of about 10 years, it averaged about 0.4 tenths of a senator. Thank you, Link Chafee of Rhode Island, who was like, yeah, but they'd never really quite overlapped, actually. So, and that's what I was going to say. And now we're at the point where, for about the last 15 years or so, there's no overlap. The voting record of Manchin, clearly the most conservative Democratic senator from West Virginia, his voting record is more liberal measured against Sheldon Whitehouse than Susan Collins from Maine. So that's how rigid things have gotten. And looking at those 15 years with no overlap, the other thing that's true is the gap gets bigger every year. And so it really is a kind of growth. You know, my students are used to seeing me when I talk about polarization. I always crank my right arm because I see it as a kind of cyclical process, that one party does something to the other party, they weaponize another role, whatever it might be, and then there's retaliation, and then it goes around and around and around.
So what would fix that?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so what would fix that? I mean, redistricting
I
at
get
the
that
Senate level wouldn't change any
I
of
got that question. I get that question a lot, and I have two categories of answers, neither of which is all that satisfying. So don't sit on the edge of your seat. The first category is disaster. In the wake of 9/11, I was still on the Hill then. We had a period of about 6 months that was a total sea change. It really was a very bipartisan place because all of a sudden the flags went up in all the windows, all the Senate offices, and people who didn't prior to that react that way began to thinking again as Americans before being Democrats or Republicans. It only lasted about 6 months, unfortunately. So I think that's one category of answer is big enough disaster, whether it's climate or terrorism or whatever it might be, a huge disaster, something maybe bigger than 9/11, might just shock our political culture out of the kind of behavior that we see right now. The other category of answers is what I call baby steps. And that is you do things little by little by little to try and improve the civility on Capitol Hill, to do things like eliminate gerrymandering in the House, which is it doesn't affect the Senate, but it's it's one of the big factors that drives polarization in the House of Representatives. You could do a lot with campaign finance if we didn't have the Supreme Court constitutional amendment process as stumbling blocks. If you could do something really big with campaign finance, you could also affect that, I think, in a dramatic way. You can make a very long list of very small steps, and it's not a very satisfying answer. I just keep waiting for the people that we elect in Washington to become grown-ups. You know, it's part of what I said when I said I'm profoundly disappointed by many of the senators, I say Republican senators now, not to be partisan, but simply because right now it's Republicans who are really on the line for having to stand up and be counted. Well, I think we. Okay. I'm sorry. Let me repeat the question. The question was, what do I see as the impact that the 2020 presidential election will have on the Senate? As you know, Democrats are in charge of the House. That's probably not in danger, although, you know, some people think that a lot of the moderate Democrats who were newly elected in swing districts that had been held by Republicans might be vulnerable because of impeachment. But I tend to think that the margin is enough that the Democrats will hold the House no matter what. The Senate is in play, not as much in play as most Democrats would like to see, but nonetheless it's in play. But I think one thing that we've seen increasingly over the last 2 decades is a return to party line voting. That's the way it was when I was growing up. And I grew up in Connecticut, and like a lot of states, Connecticut actually had a party lever. The first time I went in to vote, if you wanted to vote Democratic, you pulled the Democratic lever. If you wanted to vote Republican, you pulled the Republican lever, and that lever just it ticked down the vote for every member of the party all up and down the ticket. And you could tell by the fact that people went in, closed the curtain, you heard a metallic sound, the curtain opened and they came back out. You might not know which party they voted for, but you knew they voted for a party line. And we went through a period in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. When I was working for Tsongas doing politics in Massachusetts, even though it was even then a very democratic state, people split their tickets all the time. I can't remember the numbers involved, but I remember a Democratic governor being elected at the same time that Republican Ed Brooke was elected Attorney General, and both of them were by huge margins. Millions of split tickets. We just don't see that quite so much anymore. So, coming back to your question, my answer would be, tell me who's going to win the presidential election, and I'll have a more definitive answer about the Senate. Not absolute, because it's still somewhat of an uphill battle for Democrats. But I think if Trump is defeated, that the Democrats will get the Senate or will come very close to getting it. And I hope they won't do anything to the filibuster, no matter what Liz Warren says.
Wrap it up, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Rich, thank you so much for all of your insight. We'll have to have you back for a Defending the Filibuster lecture, which is part,
That's right.
which is which is part 2.
Stock the audience with people who want to yell at me.
Exactly. But
I'm used to that. When I wrote the book, it was Republicans at that point who were defending the filibuster and Democrats who were attacking it. And so I was invited to speak at places like the Heritage Foundation. Felt like I was in the belly of the whale.
Politics makes strange bedfellows. But thank you so much for a wonderful semester. We learned a lot from you and hope you learned a lot from our speakers. Thank you so much.